According to a Pew Research poll put out in 2009, U.S. citizens are still divided as to whether they believe in evolution or not. 61% say that it does happen, that humans and other living things have evolved over time, and 32 of those 61% say that that happened just by natural processes, whereas another 22% say that evolution was guided by a supreme being, maybe a god of some sort. But then there are still 31% that believe that humans and other living things have existed in their present form since the beginning of time. Our percentages are very low in comparison to those of other Western nations. For example, in Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden, the percentages of people that believe in evolution are much higher, whereas there's a small minority that does not. Compare that to us, which has a smaller minority that considers that it's true, a large minority that considers it unsure, and also an even larger minority still that doubts it. Amongst scientists, there's much less of an argument. 97% of scientists in the U.S. believe that humans and other things have evolved over time. A small percentage say that evolution might have been guided by a supreme being. Many just say it happens by natural processes, but 97% of scientists agree that evolution occurs, leaving only 2% that believe otherwise. So why is it that almost all scientists agree on this while the citizenry is in disagreement? Science has very little to do with what people believe. It more has to do with arguments that are either supported or refuted by evidence. And over again, the theory of evolution has been supported by powerful evidence gathered from thousands upon thousands of experiments. And in this talk, I'm going to share with you some of those categories of evidence, including transitional form fossils, biogeography, particularly around islands, homologous structures, vestigial traits, embryology, genetic similarities, and artificial selection. Let's start with transitional form fossils first. Fossils are the remains of organisms that have fallen into the perfect conditions, let's say a lake, and then got covered in sediments washed by a river, eventually becoming compacted by the pressure of added sediments until it becomes petrified or turned to rock. The fossil record gives us this series of snapshots into evolutionary history, the oldest fossils coming from the oldest strata or levels, like say this one, which is pretty old, and then the newer ones forming on top. And so if we look at fossils that are in a lower one, and then the next one up, and then the next one up, we can recreate in slow motion an idea of how evolution might have taken place. And sometimes in the hunt we find very key fossils, like say this fossil right here, which is a very famous one called Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is a reptile. You can see how much its head resembles this older fossil of a T-Rex, and yet it seems along its limbs right here to have some feathers that have been preserved, which is a suggestion for a daring claim that some scientists came up with, that modern-day birds are actually descended from dinosaurs. And it was a really daring claim, and it didn't seem to make a lot of sense until we found a key transitional form, this Archaeopteryx fossil, which lended a lot of support to that idea. So next time you look at a bird, look again a little bit closer. You're looking at the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great- our own evolution. For example, this hominid fossil is very well known. It's called Lucy. And though Lucy was not quite a modern human, she does seem to be one transitional form in the evolution of humans from our common ancestors with chimps. But fossils, old dead organisms, are not the only sources of evidence for evolution. We can also look at the biogeographical distribution of living organisms in the world as further evidence. Darwin and Wallace both thought up the idea of biogeography as evidence for evolution. I'm going to work with one of Darwin's famous examples, namely the Galapagos Islands, which you can see right here. They're floating out in the ocean just off the coast of South America. And he had previously, on his voyage of the Beagle, made some stops and surveyed some of the wildlife here on South America, and then went over to the Galapagos, and he started to see some patterns between these two that made him think a lot of evolution. On the left, you can see a green iguana which specializes in climbing trees and lives in South America. And then on the right, you can see a marine Galapagos iguana, which doesn't climb trees so well, but can climb up rocks pretty darn well. It also happens to be a very strong swimmer. He found in South America this cormorant species. Cormorants are a fishing bird, so they dive into the water, they fish, and then when they're done fishing, they hang their wings out to dry. Like you can see this one, he's kind of spreading out his wings to dry in the sun. And then when he got to the Galapagos, oh my god, he found another cormorant species. Little bit different physically. It looks like it has stubbier wings. It can't really fly, but still a good swimmer. And look, it's doing the exact same behavior. This one's spreading out its wings in the sun to dry them off. On the South American mainland, he found this prickly pear cactus. And then on the Galapagos Islands, he found another prickly pear. This is a cactus tree. It seems to have changed a little bit in that it grows much higher off the ground. And yet it has almost identically shaped cladodes, these large plate-like shapes on the plant. This does not prove evolution 100%. In science, it's impossible to gather that much support for a theory. But scientists tend to assume that the simplest explanation is the most likely. And in that way, biogeography is excellent evidence. Would be a crazy coincidence if the iguanas and the cormorants and the cacti all evolved twice, once over here and over here. It would be a much simpler explanation to say that they evolved once here, a few of the individuals got washed out to sea to the Galapagos, where they continued to evolve to suit that environment and changed, but only slightly. To this day, scientists continue to look at the species on the Galapagos Islands, particularly the ones that caught Darwin's eye at first, the finches. Upon discovering such diversity amongst the finches of the islands, Darwin hypothesized that after a small population of finches arrived on these islands, they slowly became specialized for different food sources: buds, cactus flowers, seeds, insects, and that natural selection shaped them to have beaks that were appropriate to their food source. A classic example of natural selection in action. Our next source of evidence occurs in organisms' bodies themselves, and they're called homologous structures. Already learned that the prefix homo means same. And homologous structures are parts of our bodies and the bodies of other organisms that are similar internally. For example, if you compare the bone arrangement inside the wings of a bat, the flipper of a whale, the leg of a cat, and the arm of a human, you'll find great similarities. While the shapes are different, you can still see phalanges, these long skinny bones on the end of each limb. Carpals and metacarpals in the wrist, a radius and ulna in the forearm, and a humerus bone on top. What is the simplest explanation for these similarities? Biologists argue that most probably humans, cats, whales, and bats once shared a common ancestor that also had this bone arrangement. And then, over time, evolution shaped that old bone arrangement to become different as each organism evolved for its particular environment. So human hands are very good for handling tools, while bat wings are very good for flying, whale flippers very good for swimming, and cat paws very good for pouncing. But all of them still hold clues to our common ancestry. Here's another example of homologous structures from the class Insecta. Though wasps, ants, and dragonflies all have very different food sources, very different mating practices, and very different bodies in many ways, part of their structures are still homologous. They each have 3 parts to their body: head, thorax, abdomen. Head, thorax, abdomen. Head, thorax, abdomen. Even our friend, that disguised mantis that had those leaf-like outer wing casings, also has 3 sections. You can see here's the head right at the top, thorax right here in the middle, and then abdomen back towards the end. Even though these organisms look on the surface very different, when you see these patterns, it suggests that they all evolved from a common ancestor that also had 3 body parts.